Most mornings, my day starts before the sun pulls itself over the bay. I lace up and head to the Embarcadero, the air damp and briny, the kind of cold that wakes your lungs before your head. The bay bridge looms in the distance, a steel spine stretching across the water. The fog is always there, rolling in like it owns the place, swallowing the tops of ferries and hiding Alcatraz in soft gray. The pavement under my shoes feels familiar enough to be a friend, each crack and dip part of a map I've memorized without ever trying. I keep a steady pace past the ferry building, where vendors are unloading crates of produce for a farmer's market I'll never have time to visit. Sometimes I catch the smell of fresh sourdough from Acme bread, still warm, and I let it trail me for a few blocks before the wind takes it. By 8, I'm in the glass elevator at Salesforce Tower, rising past floors of people I'll only ever see in passing. The city folds away beneath me. From up here, San Francisco feels almost manageable, like a diorama you could rearrange if you just had the right tweezers. My badge beeps me into Luminatech, CFO, 38, professional firefighter of other people's financial messes. I spend my days in boardrooms where no one says what they mean, and my job is to make the numbers behave even when the people never will. Evenings are a different kind of performance. Our apartment sits 30 floors above the Embarcadero, with glass walls that turn the bay into wallpaper. At night, the Bay Bridge lights cut a clean white line across the water, and Vanessa calls it our lighthouse. It's supposed to sound romantic. Lately, it feels like a beacon for one. She's Luminateca's PR director, flawless in heels, fluent in charm, the kind of woman who can turn a hostile reporter into a dinner guest before dessert. We've been married 8 years. We still share space, but in the past few months, I've felt her drifting, like she's saving her sharpest smiles for somewhere I'm not. She works late, more often now, always on a project that can't wait until morning. Always in Ryan Holt's office, our CEO, my old friend from Harvard, because that's where the real decisions get made. I tell myself it's nothing, that marriages have seasons, and maybe we're just in one that calls for patience. So I make small adjustments. Better coffee beans from Blue Bottle. A new playlist for our morning runs, though she skips them more often than not. I polished the quarterly forecast until it could hang in the MoMA, as if precision on paper could fix what's out of alignment in a marriage. The city keeps humming regardless. Streetcars rumble down Market Street. Tourists cluster outside Pier 39. The foghorn moans from somewhere near Treasure Island. On certain nights, from the balcony, you can hear the faint laughter spilling out of Coquita on Pier 5, carried just right by the wind. San Francisco is beautiful that way, always offering noise, warmth, distraction. It's also a city where secrets don't have to hide in shadows. They can sit right beside you, in a crowded bar or a dim restaurant, invisible to anyone who isn't looking too closely. If betrayal has a scent, I can't name it yet, but I know the air's changed. The same way you smell ozone before a storm or notice the wind shift when the fog starts to roll in. I've lived here long enough to read those signs. Something's coming. I just don't know if it's going to break gently or tear everything apart. It was one of those late spring Saturdays when San Francisco decides to show off. Sky so blue it almost looks fake. The bay catching sunlight like it's holding on to summer, and a breeze just strong enough to make the flags outside the ferry building crack like applause. Luminateca's corporate brunch was at Water Bar, a glass and polish kind of place where the oysters arrive like little sculptures on ice, and the view does half the work of conversation. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Bay Bridge, and inside, every table was filled with people who knew how to smile without letting anything slip. I'd been on my feet for over an hour, shaking hands, trading small talk with board members, investors, a few journalists who'd been invited to casually pick up the company's talking points. My coffee was cold by the time I made it back to the bar for a refill, and that's when I saw her. Vanessa was across the room at a corner table, radiant as if the lighting had been built for her alone. Across from her sat Ryan Holt, our CEO, my former Harvard roommate, a man I'd once trusted with my worst ideas and my best plans. His posture was easy, leaning in just enough to make whatever he was saying feel like a secret meant only for her. Vanessa's hand rested on the stem of her champagne flute, her head tilted slightly, smiling in that wide, unguarded way she used to when we first met. Then it happened. Barely a flicker, almost nothing. Her fingers brushed against his wrist. Not long, not obvious. But it wasn't the kind of gesture you make to your boss at a company brunch. Ryan said something, and she laughed, too quick, too warm. They didn't notice me at first. From where I stood, the rest of the room seemed to fade around them. When Ryan's eyes finally caught mine, he didn't miss a beat, just shifted in his chair, letting the distance between them grow by an inch. Vanessa straightened, her smile recalibrating into something cooler, more practiced. I crossed the room, my own smile in place like a tie knotted a little too tight. Ryan greeted me with an easy handshake, sliding effortlessly into a conversation about the product launch and the latest funding round. Vanessa added a note here and there about media reception, her tone smooth, professional. It was seamless, almost rehearsed. But numbers are my business, and I know when they don't add up. In finance, small discrepancies are never just small. They point to something bigger beneath the surface. And that's exactly what I felt standing there, that the scene I'd walked into wasn't an isolated moment, but a glimpse of something with history. The rest of the brunch unfolded as expected. Clinking glasses, a toast about growth and innovation. The whole team posing for a group photo against the sparkling bay. We looked perfect, but the image I carried home wasn't the one the photographer snapped. It was the one burned into the back of my mind. Vanessa leaning in, Ryan's wrist under her fingertips. That night, on our balcony, she told me the brunch had been wonderful. I nodded, keeping my hands wrapped around my glass, saying nothing. Below us, the fog drifted in slow, patient waves, swallowing the bridge lights one by one. Somewhere deep down, I knew, storms don't arrive without warning. The first drop is easy to ignore, but it always means the clouds are already here. In finance, bad news doesn't usually crash through the door. It arrives quietly, slipping into the room like a draft you only notice when you're already cold. The Monday after the brunch at Water Bar, I was back behind my desk on the 57th floor of Salesforce Tower, San Francisco spread out beneath me in a patchwork of glass, water, and low fog. The morning light had that muted, silvery quality the city wears in May. My monitor glowed with spreadsheets, but my mind kept wandering back to that corner table. Vanessa leaning in, Ryan's wrist under her fingertips, and that brief flicker in her smile when she saw me. Clara Jensen, my assistant, came in around 10. 3 years in this job had made her the quiet engine that kept my day moving. Sharp, loyal, and observant in ways I sometimes forgot to account for. She set a stack of revised projections on my desk, neat and precise as always. Vanessa's been in with Ryan a lot lately, she said, her tone light, like she was just filling air. But her eyes stayed on me a little too long. I glanced up, keeping my voice neutral. A lot. Clara adjusted her glasses, a tiny shrug following. Late nights. Lights on in his office long after the rest of the floor is dark. She told me they were polishing presentations for the Series D pitch. A pause. Guess they must be polishing a lot. The words were casual enough, but they sank into me like ink spreading through water. Ryan's office was 2 floors up. I knew his habits, when he worked late, when he didn't. And Vanessa, well, I'd never thought to track hers. Not until now. The rest of the day unraveled slowly. I had lunch at the Grove on Mission, sitting by the window, barely touching the grilled chicken salad. I kept catching myself replaying Clara's comment, wondering whether it had been accidental or deliberate. Meetings blurred together. The forecast numbers in front of me could have been written in another language for all the focus I had left. By 5, the fog had thickened into something almost solid, pressing against the windows of the tower. I caught my reflection in the glass, tie loosened, jaw tight, and recognized the look. Not suspicion exactly, but the restless need to verify, to know. It's the same expression I get when I sense a line item on a balance sheet is hiding something. In my world, small discrepancies are never just small. They're symptoms of something deeper, something that eventually surfaces whether you want it to or not. That night, Vanessa texted that she'd be working late. I sat alone in our apartment, the bridge outside already swallowed by fog, the lights just a soft glow in the mist. Her wine glass from the night before was still on the counter, a faint lipstick mark on the rim. I poured myself 2 fingers of Macallan, leaned back in the armchair, and stared out at the haze. I told myself I wasn't keeping track, but the truth was harder to swallow. From that moment forward, I started counting. The late nights, the missed dinners, the quiet hours where the space between us felt wider than the view from our balcony. It was a Thursday night when the first undeniable crack in the glass appeared, the kind that doesn't shatter everything, yet, but makes you hear that faint, impossible to ignore creak every time you move. Vanessa had told me she'd be home early. We'd talked about takeout from Burma's Superstar, maybe finally opening that bottle of 2018 Cabernet we'd been saving from our Napa trip. A simple night. Normal. By 7, I'd wrapped up at Luminatech and walked down Mission Street under a light drizzle. The rain was just enough to paint the pavement in rippling neon, reflections of streetlights, and the glowing Muni sign outside the station. My thoughts were already drifting toward the couch, the wine, her laugh when she finally kicked off her heels. When I stepped into the apartment, the quiet felt wrong. Not peaceful, hollow. The rack by the door was empty, no coat, no shoes. A faint hum came from the kitchen. Her laptop sat open on the counter, the screensaver off. Normally, I wouldn't look. We both travel in and out of each other's calendars for meetings and dinners without thinking twice. But tonight, my eyes caught something unfamiliar. Ritz-Carlton, private dinner. 7:30 p.m. It was neatly blocked in navy blue, labeled work event. But she'd told me she'd be home. My hand rested on the counter a little too long, the cool stone grounding me while a thought I didn't want to name began to take shape. 10 minutes later, I was driving north, windshield wipers clicking in sync with my heartbeat. The Ritz sits like a quiet fortress at the top of Nob Hill, all marble columns and warm gold lighting spilling onto Stockton Street. I parked a half block away, cutting the engine but leaving the heater on just enough to keep the windows from fogging. I told myself I wasn't spying, just confirming. At 8:15, the glass doors parted, and there they were. Vanessa in her black sheath dress, the one she reserves for investor dinners. Hair swept back, the glint of earrings I'd bought her on our 5th anniversary. Ryan walked beside her, his hand resting at the small of her back with casual ownership. They were laughing, not the polite, networking kind, but the easy, leaning-in kind that belongs to late nights and shared secrets. They didn't look around. They didn't need to. The valet already had the black Tesla Model S idling at the curb. Ryan opened the door for her, and she slipped inside like she'd done it 100 times. A moment later, the taillights cut through the mist, disappearing down California Street. I stayed where I was, fingers locked around the steering wheel, my breath visible in the cooling air. A doorman stood under the awning, smoking and watching the fog swallow their car. For a second, it felt like he was watching me too, like he knew exactly what I'd just seen. Back at the apartment, the unopened wine bottle sat under the warm kitchen light, a silent reminder of the night I'd imagined. I didn't open it. Instead, I turned off the lights, sat on the couch in the dark, and stared at the faint outline of the Bay Bridge until it dissolved into fog. Somewhere between the Ritz and here, I realized this wasn't suspicion anymore. This was evidence. And once you have evidence, you can't go back to pretending. All day Friday, I carried the words like a loaded briefcase I wasn't ready to open. I went through the motions, emails, meetings, approving budget revisions, but every pause, every lull in conversation, I was rehearsing. I imagined it in the kitchen, maybe while she poured herself a glass of wine. Vanessa, why were you at the Ritz with Ryan? I could see her face in my mind, surprise first, then the narrowing of her eyes, then a shift into some well-crafted explanation. And I could hear myself, calm but unyielding, not giving her room to twist out of it. But the hours passed, and with them came the familiar fog, rolling in off the bay and curling between the towers of downtown. By the time I drove along the Embarcadero toward our building, the city was washed in soft gray, the Bay Bridge lights blurred like a watercolor. My grip on the steering wheel was steady. That felt like control. She arrived just after 7, the click of her heels echoing on the hardwood before I saw her. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, hair slightly damp, eyes bright in a way that made it hard to pin anything dark to her. In her hands, a bottle of Cabernet, not the Napa one we'd been saving, but from the same vineyard. She placed it on the counter with a little flourish. "Thought we could celebrate making it through another week," she said, smiling as if nothing in our lives had shifted. I told myself, now, this is the moment. But instead, I watched her move around the kitchen, opening cabinets, slicing manchego, arranging crackers with the same unhurried rhythm she's always had at the end of a work week. She asked about my day, nodded thoughtfully at my vague answer, and launched into a plan for a weekend getaway. "Maybe Carmel," she said, "or Mendocino, somewhere we can just unplug." Her gaze held mine, warm and steady, and for a moment it felt like the air between us hadn't changed at all. The conversation moved easily, too easily. I sipped the wine, let her voice fill the room. Every few minutes, the memory of the Ritz would rise, Ryan's hand at her back, their laughter under the gold lights. But it kept colliding with the present. Her laughter now, the way she reached across the counter to brush my arm, the light catching the edge of her smile. I waited for the opening that never came. Or maybe I saw it and chose not to take it. By the time the second glass was gone, the words I'd been carrying all day felt heavier, but also strangely distant, like they belonged to another version of me. Later, in the dark, I told myself this was patience. Strategy. Not every battle needs to be fought the second you spot it on the horizon. But lying there beside her, listening to her breathing settle into sleep, I knew it wasn't strategy at all. It was hesitation, the dangerous kind that lets something grow in the shadows while you tell yourself you're still in control. The 61st floor of Salesforce Tower is designed to impress. Polished marble, endless glass, and views that make even the most jaded investor pause. From up here, San Francisco looks almost still, the fog sitting low over the bay while the sunlight punches through in narrow beams. It's the perfect setting for a pitch, the kind that turns cautious interest into a signed check. And that morning, it was our turn. Luminatech was unveiling a major initiative, the one meant to lock in our Series D funding and cement Ryan's reputation as a visionary. My team had been deep in the numbers for months, building projections sturdy enough to withstand any amount of probing. Or so I thought. Ryan stood at the front, flanked by the city skyline like it was part of the presentation. He spoke with the ease of someone who'd been in this exact position dozens of times, never faltering, never hesitating. Vanessa was 2 seats to his left, perfectly composed, the very image of a PR director in her element. Her dress was a deep shade of navy, sharp but understated, the kind of detail she always got right. When Ryan introduced her, he didn't just nod in her direction. He turned toward her, his voice softening. And none of this would be possible without the tireless work and brilliance of Vanessa Cole. She smiled at the applause, modest, gracious, though I caught the quick flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. The lights dimmed, and the slides came up. At first, everything felt familiar. But a few minutes in, the numbers started to shift in ways I hadn't approved. Growth rates smoothed just enough to hide the volatility we'd discussed. Revenue projections were more than optimistic. They were dressed up, wearing shoes they hadn't earned. And then the big one, an expense category that had quietly shrunk by several million, reclassified, to make our margins gleam like polished chrome. From my seat, I scanned the faces in the room. Investors leaned in. Board members nodded. No one was catching it. No one but me. And maybe Vanessa, because when I glanced her way, she was already looking at me, her expression unreadable but not unaware. Ryan moved through the deck like a conductor leading an orchestra, building toward a close that felt inevitable. The applause at the end was instant, almost eager. He basked in it, then gestured toward Vanessa again. Couldn't have done it without her. Afterward, The floor was a blur of handshakes and cameras. Ryan and Vanessa stood at the center of it, drawing people in like gravity. He leaned toward her to say something just below the hum of voices. She laughed, not loudly, but with that soft, familiar warmth I'd once thought was mine alone. Her hand found his arm briefly as someone brushed past. That small contact hit harder than any number I'd just seen twisted on a screen. Walking back to my office, the buzz of conversation still in the air, I knew this was bigger than whatever was happening between them personally. This was about control, over the narrative, over the numbers, over the company's future. And if I didn't step carefully, they weren't just going to cut me out of my marriage. They were going to cut me out of Luminatech itself. The thing about corporate life is that secrets don't usually sit in a neat folder waiting to be found. They leak. Not all at once, but in fragments, in throwaway lines, in the wrong attachment sent to the wrong person. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind of day when the fog clings to the windows of Salesforce Tower like it's trying to listen in. Clara stepped into my office, carrying a stack of printed invoices. She set them down carefully, her voice low. "These came through the shared finance drive this morning," she said. "They weren't meant for us." I glanced at the top page. It was a hotel invoice, Hotel Zeta, booked under a corporate card I recognized as belonging to the executive budget pool. Room service for 2. Multiple nights. No reference to any client meetings. Behind it, another invoice, Ritz-Carlton. Then airline receipts for quick round trips to Los Angeles. All billed as media relations travel. Clara shifted her weight, hesitating. "I only noticed because the cost center codes were wrong. They're using one of your project codes to bill these." That got my attention. I pulled up the finance portal and cross-referenced the transactions. The codes matched projects I'd personally signed off on, but the expenses had been moved there after the fact. Someone with high-level access had gone into the system and rerouted them to my department. I dug deeper. Each expense lined up, almost too neatly, with dates I remembered Vanessa working late on presentations with Ryan. There were also small but telling overlaps, like a lunch at Foreign Cinema logged under a vendor meeting the same day I'd seen her calendar marked as off-site prep. The financial side of it was damning enough, but the pattern was worse. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping, it was deliberate. A paper trail designed to make it look like I'd been signing off on their extracurricular spending, both corporate and personal. When I looked up, Clara was watching me carefully. "You didn't get these from me," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. I sat back in my chair, the invoices spread across the desk like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to finish. In my world, numbers tell stories. And here was a story where the villains weren't even bothering to hide the ending. They'd just written me out entirely. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with just betrayal or office politics. This was a setup. And if I didn't act soon, the next board meeting wouldn't be about Ryan's vision or Vanessa's PR strategy. It would be about whether I still had a job at all. Once I saw the pattern in the expenses, I couldn't unsee it. Dates, locations, cost center codes. They all lined up too neatly, like someone had built a paper trail brick by brick. But numbers, even damning ones, can still be argued away in a boardroom. I needed something no one could spin, something they couldn't explain without choking on their own words. The chance came 3 nights later. Luminatech was hosting a private investor dinner at Foreign Cinema, a perfect cover. Ryan would be there, charming as ever. Vanessa too, perfectly in her role as the company's public face. I showed up on time, did the usual rounds, a few handshakes, polite laughs at predictable jokes, a short conversation about market trends with a man who thought blockchain was the future of accounting. All the while, I kept one eye on them. By 10:15 p.m., the crowd had thinned, leaving a scattering of guests nursing coffee and dessert wine. I slipped out through the side exit onto 21st Street, the air cooler now, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt. My car was parked a little way down, engine off, windows cracked just enough to keep them from fogging. The street was quiet except for the occasional rumble of a bus turning onto Mission. At 10:47, they appeared, not from the front entrance with the other guests, but from the side door, slipping out like a shared secret. Vanessa was laughing softly, head tilted toward Ryan. His hand rested at the small of her back in a way that didn't need explaining. They weren't rushing. They weren't cautious. It was the unhurried confidence of two people who believed they wouldn't be seen. They walked down the block, their silhouettes blurred in the fog, until they stopped at the Hotel Zeta entrance. The valet straightened as soon as he saw them, greeting them by name. No hesitation, no check-in, just familiarity. He took Vanessa's coat while Ryan reached into his pocket for something that caught the lobby light, likely a key card, not a reservation. From where I stood, I raised my phone, hands steady despite the adrenaline. The lens caught them in a sequence, Ryan holding the door, Vanessa looking up at him mid-laugh, their shoulders brushing as they crossed the threshold. I took enough frames to remove any doubt about who they were and where they were going. When the glass doors closed, I stayed in the car for a while, the photos still open on my screen. The hum of the city felt distant, muffled. Every landmark on the drive home. The glow of the Bay Bridge, the ferry building clock, even the street outside our apartment, looked different now. Like they belonged to a city where I'd been living someone else's life without realizing it. These weren't suspicions anymore. They weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or whispers in a hallway. They were images, time-stamped and irrefutable. And in the right room, they'd speak louder than I ever could. The boardroom on the 62nd floor has the kind of view that's supposed to inspire confidence. Sweeping glass, the bay glittering beyond, the Golden Gate Bridge barely visible through the morning haze. But that morning, the view was nothing more than wallpaper. All eyes were on the polished walnut table and on me. The meeting began like any other, quarterly performance, market outlook, updates on the Series D funding. Ryan spoke first, confident as ever, painting a picture of steady growth and visionary leadership. Vanessa sat to his right, flipping through her notes, occasionally adding a polished soundbite about brand positioning. It was a performance they'd rehearsed for months. When it was my turn, I didn't start with words. I slid a slim black folder onto the center of the table. Before we continue, I said, my voice even, there are some discrepancies in our financial reporting I think the board should see. I began with the expense reports, hotel invoices, travel receipts, all billed under my department without authorization. I projected them on the screen, each date aligning perfectly with calendar entries for off-site work that didn't exist. Then came the side-by-side comparison of the investor presentation Ryan had given versus the real financials approved by my office. The differences weren't subtle, they were surgical. The room was silent except for the soft click of the remote as I moved through the slides. Then, the photographs appeared. Ryan and Vanessa, side by side at Hotel Zeta, time-stamped, their faces unmistakable. Another at the Ritz-Carlton, walking hand in hand to his car. I didn't narrate those. I let the images hang in the air until the weight of them was undeniable. When I finally looked up, the atmosphere had shifted. The investors' expressions had hardened. A few members of the board exchanged glances, the kind that carry entire conversations without words. Ryan cleared his throat, leaning forward. This is a misunderstanding. But the chairwoman cut him off. Enough, Ryan. Her tone left no room for maneuvering. Vanessa's gaze stayed fixed on the table. Her hands, perfectly still until now, curled into fists so tight her knuckles paled. By the time I gathered my papers, the decision wasn't official, but it was already made. The board had seen enough to question everything. Whatever happened next, Ryan and Vanessa wouldn't walk away untouched. As I left the room, the fog outside had begun to thin, the bay emerging in sharp detail. For the first time in weeks, I felt the same clarity. This was no longer about suspicion or doubt. It was about proof, and proof changes everything. 2 weeks after the boardroom, my office at Luminatech was stripped down to bare walls. The last box on my desk held a few books, some pens, and a framed photo of the Bay Bridge, taken on a clear night when Vanessa and I still believed we were building something together. HR called it a mutually beneficial separation, the kind of language that hides teeth under a smile. In reality, it was a golden parachute. Enough to make walking away painless, financially, at least. Ryan hadn't shown his face since that meeting. The board had placed him on administrative leave, which, in corporate dialect, means we're deciding how to erase you quietly. I heard whispers that his resignation was being drafted before the coffee even cooled that morning. Vanessa moved out the same week. No confrontation, no final fight, just an email with her new mailing address for logistical purposes. Like we were strangers splitting a storage unit. The absence was louder than any argument could have been. We didn't exchange accusations because there was nothing left to salvage. When trust is gone, words are just noise. On my first morning without an agenda or a commute, I walked down to Crissy Field. The air was cold enough to sting, the fog curling low over the water, but the Golden Gate Bridge was emerging through it like something ancient and unshaken. I sat on a weathered bench, watching the bay breathe in slow swells. Sailboats leaned into the wind, slicing the surface with clean, purposeful lines. Betrayal isn't a single blow. It's erosion. It starts small, a late night at the office, a number quietly altered, a promise bent just enough to keep from breaking. You don't notice the foundation shifting until the walls around you are already hollow. I thought of all the years I'd invested. Every late night at the tower, every carefully balanced projection, every dinner postponed for work. I'd built two structures at once, a company and a marriage. And in the end, both had been repurposed into tools to push me out. The numbers and the photographs weren't just proof. They were monuments to intent. As the wind picked up, I stood. The bridge loomed ahead, its towers rising into thinning fog. Bridges are rebuilt after they fall, but the steel always remembers the stress. Trust is the same. I didn't feel victorious. There was no orchestra swelling, no freeze frame of me walking away in slow motion. What I felt was sharper clarity. The game they'd been playing was still unfolding somewhere behind glass walls, but I'd stepped off the board entirely. Walking along the shoreline, I realized the real victory wasn't in exposing them. It was in reclaiming the part of me they couldn't touch. The part that still knew the difference between building and destroying. And maybe, someday, I'd build again. But not with them. Never with them.